Howdy neighbor, how is your garden growing? My garden, today we're going to be talking about the month of January, what you should be planting, whether it's vegetables, tropical fruits, flowers, or what's going to bring color and life and beauty to your garden so you can make the garden of your dreams in the Sunshine State. And as always, I'm going to be using my handy dandy Wild Floridian garden planner to help keep us on track. So happy new year, and it is time to figure out what we're going to be planting. Let's first talk vegetable. In the month of January, of course, whether you live in North Florida to South Florida, zone 8s or zone 10s, you need to know there's a lot of gardening you should be doing right now when it comes to veggies. And no matter which one of these zones or areas of Florida you live in, cold weather crops is for you. In the month of January, you can be starting from seed or transplant tons of different cold weather crops. Everything from lettuces, carrots, onions, brassicas, from broccolis, cauliflowers, cabbages, kale, oh my gosh, beets. But let's talk some specific recommendations, because it's good to say you can do cold weather crops. It's good to say you can do broccoli, but which variety? When it comes to broccolis, I am a big fan of this Waltham 29. I'm growing two different types of broccoli this year, Waltham 29s and the Chico. But Waltham 29 has hands down, whether it's from seed to as it's been growing, has been doing the best for me over here in zone 10. When it comes to our kales, Dino Kale is my favorite. This one starts well, goes long, and will be a kale that will not only last you through the month of January, but will actually survive into some of the higher heat and sun intensity that we see later in the year. Another crop that you should be considering doing in the month of January is plants like these beets. These are the Detroit red beets. Not only can you use the beet itself, but you can use the leaves. So this can be a really good substitute for adding things like vitamin K and vitamin A into your smoothies. If you're considering doing onions, you got a bunch of different options. I've been really liking these Texas grano onions. They're a sweet onion that can grow really, really well here in Florida and in states like Texas. And if you're someone who doesn't maybe want whole onions, but just the onion greens, you of course could use these Texas granos, but you could also use something like these ever-bearing white green onions. These are the same thing as scallions. You just use these toppers and you'll have onion flavoring and lots of dishes. For those of you who are looking for carrot varieties, I really enjoyed this short and sweet carrot. It has not been very short, but it was very sweet. They actually ended up growing quite large for us because we left them in the ground for a really long time. So if you're looking for a small carrot that you can harvest pretty quickly, or you want to leave it in ground and get giant carrots, short and sweet might be for you. And of course, when it comes to cold weather crops, you should always be considering doing lettuces. It is one of the best return on investment crops. And here in Florida, you want to really focus on cut and come again. We have a lot of bugs here, aka pest pressure. So the odds of you getting a full head of lettuce before a bug gets to it, well, they're not really great. So when you do things that are cut and come again, you can harvest before the bugs get a big hold or even get to your crop. This year, I'm testing out 3 different varieties of romaine. Typically in stores, I know you usually see these as head lettuces, but we use them as cut and come again. Comes to the different romaine varieties I'm testing this year, I have ones like Outrageous, Cosmo, Sweet Valentine, and another variety to add in to not only have cut and come again, but also had a lot of sweetness to your salad is, of course, Butter Crunch. And when it comes to Butter Crunch, you could let it get to a small head, or you can just do the cut and come method. Oh, and before I move on from those cold weather crops, of course, you should be thinking about, whether in North Florida, Central Florida, or South Florida, potatoes. Your classic potatoes. If you want to do those, this would be the time of year to do it. Now, my zone 9s, my Central Floridians, and my South Floridians, beyond doing cold weather crops, you guys should definitely be doing your warm weather crops. You want to focus on everything from tomatoes, cucumbers, squash plants, pepper plants. All of these things would be in season to start getting done by seed or by transplant. Comes to things like tomatoes, you want to consider things like getting your larger fruiting plants. You know, the ones that get tomatoes that are like this size. You want to get those in the ground now so that you can get things like these 4th of July variety, or very similar as Early Treat. And if you're new to gardening Florida and you've heard about lots of struggles with tomatoes, the variety, of course, that I recommend the most would be Everglades tomatoes. These plants, well, for all y'all who saw me plant this plant, I mean, it's grown an insane amount in just a month. And they put out an obnoxious amount of small, tiny tomatoes. Very similar to a currant style tomato. It's going to put out small little tomatoes that are going to be great as you're walking through your vegetable garden, popping them into your mouth. But beware, they grow huge. Having just 4 plants is going to be an obnoxious amount of tomatoes for me to harvest this year. And in past years, I've done even up to 8. You will get so many pounds of tomatoes, but you will also get them popping up all across your yard. So if you can get them started, they're a little slow to start from seed, then you will have tomatoes on tomatoes and tomatoes. And unlike some of the varieties that put out larger fruit, because this fruit is so small, it can go the distance into the heat, humidity, intense sun that we will see much later in the year. So if you're thinking about doing tomatoes and you're a beginner, strongly consider things like Everglades tomato. Oh, look, we got some coming in. Hooray! And when it comes to things like pepper plants, I would strongly recommend Cubanelle peppers. I know many people want to try to get that classic bell pepper, and they often struggle, especially in central South Florida. But Cubanelle peppers can give you that same crunch. They can have the same mild, slightly sweet, but not too much of a bite when it comes to the taste. And here where I lived, Cubanelle peppers often produce peppers almost the entirety of the year. So if you're looking for a really good pepper harvest that you can add to things like salads, soups, or even into chilies, Cubanelle pepper is highly recommended. But of course, we also mentioned that you could do things like squash plants. But while I don't have a particular recommendation for warm weather squash varieties, I do have one for hot weather varieties. And that goes to my people in South Florida. If you live in a zone 10 or 11 in the month of January, you can start getting your hot weather crops going. That's things like roselle and Seminole pumpkins. Hold on to your okras for the moment, but we're getting pretty close to that time of year where you could be starting those by seed. And if you're not familiar with Seminole pumpkins, this is an indeterminate type squash, so they will send runners all over the place. So make sure that wherever you plant them, you have tons of space. Their pumpkin fruit are this nice light tan color, and they only produce fruit that's just a few pounds. So no worries that you're gonna have a giant pumpkin for you to eat. Got a pumpkin. You have one of these. This is like a nice size. For comparison, I mean, it's a good size. And this one wasn't a full sun area because they can get a bit bigger than this too. But let's go a little bit beyond vegetables, because isn't variety the spice of life? Or is it herbs that are the spice of life? And you may be considering adding to your garden some herbs. When it comes to the month of January, there are a few different herbs that you should consider adding to your garden. This is one of the few times a year that you can actually grow cilantro. Much of the year you can grow coriander, but this time of year you might actually get cilantro. And if you're new to the whole idea of cilantro and coriander, they're two different spices / herbs, but one is the seed and the other part is just the leaf of the same plant. But for those of us who live in the subtropics and tropics, it can become a little bit challenging to get the leaf part. Oftentimes the plant is bolting and putting on flowers and then seeds really quickly most of the year. But January is one of the times of the year, whether you want to plant it from seed or if you already have a plant that you can go put out your garden, to actually get cilantro. So think about whether you're going to be making some fresh guacamole, you're going to be drying some of those cilantros, or you're going to be looking forward to those future coriander seeds. I know for many of us Floridians, it can be a struggle to get a really substantial garlic crop like Northerners do, but if you're looking for garlic to be one of the flavors that you have in a lot of dishes, you can get around this in Florida by doing things like using garlic chives. This aggressive growing plant can be put in a pot and you can cut and come again and again and again and again, so that you can get that garlic flavor throughout many of your dishes throughout the year without having to worry about how hot or cold it gets. This plant is definitely one that you're going to want to put in a container pot because it grows and grows and grows down here in the subtropics / tropics. But that can be a huge benefit for you because you plant it once and then you can cut and come again, not only in January, but throughout the year. Some other classic herbs that you may want to consider adding to your garden are things like thyme, fennel, and parsley. Now, when it comes to tropical plants, there's really not many that you should be doing right now, but that doesn't mean you won't be getting harvest from tropical plants even in the month of January. Plants like bananas, even in South Florida, can be producing right now. Of course, we have plants like our papaya, and for my zone 10s and 11s, even plants like your sweet potatoes can be going strong at this time of year, as long as you give them a little bit of warm weather protection, because when it gets cold, they're really not happy about it. But when it comes to the month of January, if you're looking for a crop that's tropical that will produce, citrus is for you. Here in Florida, of course, you can be growing everything from your classic oranges, lemons, limes, key limes, and of course, one of my favorites is the calamandan, aka the calamansi. Small citrus like this is great because we're a bit challenged with a disease called citrus greening. And don't worry, it's not just Florida, it's everywhere in the world. So many of the crops that take a long time, I'm talking about those ones that take 5 to 10 years to produce their crops, are finding it a bit of a struggle. And because citrus trees take up quite a bit of space, it can be a bit daunting to think that 5 to 7 years from now, you're going to find out that you're having a challenge. But when it comes to plants like the columbine, you can get citrus relatively quickly within a year of planting it, and it can actually produce a couple rounds of crops in a year. But enough about food, let's talk about flowers. In the month of January here in Florida, we have many plants that can actually be blooming. If you're thinking about going with things like native wildflowers, plants like tropical sage, climbing aster, dune sunflower, Biden's alba, and salt and pepper are phenomenal plants that produce small blooms over and over and over and over again. These can create visual interest and add to a cottage garden wildflower type look. And all these wildflowers, beyond just adding blooms, are really important for supporting our various wildlife. So when it comes to bees, butterflies, or birds, tropical sage and this flamingo pink are an amazing plant to add to your garden. If you're looking for something a little bit more substantial to help your bees, go ahead and think about bushes like the tea bush, aka gray leaf. For small, medium shrubs, of course, we have Lantana involucrata, aka button sage. They put out these small clusters of flowers, which can help feed butterflies, bees, and when they produce berries, will help birds too. If you're looking for a native vine to help support wildlife and add a nice scent, go ahead and go with climbing aster. And of course, you can get some cheery yellow that you can add to your ground with things like dune sunflower. Now, beyond wildflowers, there are other plants that can always add a lot of color to your garden. When it comes to some of the non-native species, you could of course go with camellia if you live in North and Central Florida. But if you don't live in North or Central Florida, you should also consider in South Florida plants like ixora. Ixora is an amazing Florida-friendly plant. It is not native, but ixora is known to be a great supporter of large butterflies, and for the ones that berry, can actually feed some of our birds. If you're looking for trees that are going to go into bloom or add a lot of color to your garden, you should also consider things like the exotic Hong Kong orchid. Do make sure though you did not get the invasive type. And if you live in Central and North Florida, you can go and add a lot of color with a native Florida maple. Whew, wow, that was like a lot of plants we went through. But you also need to have a successful garden in the month of January, is you need some tips and tricks to keep you on track. So when it comes to my tips for the month of January, we're gonna first talk about the seasonal tips. First off is that you need to pay attention to water needs. January is definitely drought season for Florida, which is a weird thing to say because it's still gonna rain. It's still gonna rain more in the month of January than it will in the entirety of the year for Las Vegas, which is crazy to think about, but it's still a drought for us, which means if you're putting in new plants or you have plants that don't have very deep root systems, it is very, very, very likely that they are going to start to get stressed out from a lack of water. When it comes to Florida, we have a lot of water just below the surface from our aquifers and springs, but when it comes to January, that water is getting very deep in the ground. So my plants like natives, which have roots that can go 3 feet, 6 feet down, they're not struggling. But when it comes to plants like your vegetables, well, it can quickly turn into, they look so good and then they did not. So consider making sure that you are checking your soil regularly to make sure that it is slightly moist, not soggy. Now, for those who've been following along with what to plant, when to plant it, and the great tips that I give, you should be considering adding some compost or fertilizer to your classic vegetable garden. January is about the halfway point in the classic vegetable season down here in Florida, which means that a lot of the nutrients that came in the bag soil that you bought or the original fertilizers and compost you put in have been kind of sucked up and used by your plants. So be prepared in the month of January just to refresh a little bit so that they can make it through the rest of the season. And you can do a 2-for-1, both dealing with the fact that we're in drought season and the refreshing of nutrients by adding a slow breakdown mulch, whether it's going to be wood chips, grass clippings, that can do a 2-for-1, both helping evaporation slow down in your garden and adding some natural moisture, plus adding some nutrients into your garden. Now, this next tip has to do not with vegetable gardens, but it's actually going to deal more with our tropical plants. For those of you in Central and South Florida who are pushing into those tropical plants like bananas, papayas, mangoes, breadfruit, and so many more, you may find that your plants look very stressed, even if you're watering them correctly and fertilizing them correctly, because this time of year we have the lowest UV index, and tropical plants tend to love really strong, intense sun. So even if everything's going perfectly from the temperatures, water, fertilizers, you may find that your plants still will be stressed because of the lack of sunlight at this time of year. And when it comes to wildlife, whether you want it in your garden or not, you will find that when it comes to bugs, there's just a lot less of them. Because whether you live in North Florida or South Florida, we have more days in the month of January that are below 60 degrees. And 60 degrees is a key temperature when it comes to insect populations. The amount of time we spend below 60 degrees is going to determine how much pest pressure you're going to have later in winter and definitely in spring. So you can take advantage of this time of year by getting lots and lots of seedlings going and not worrying about little caterpillars and moths and all the other goodies coming to eat them. But if you're into wildlife like me and you're looking forward to attracting things like bees and butterflies and birds to your garden, this is a really important time of year to have things that provide nectar, seeds, and berries to your garden. Remember, Florida is subtropical and tons of birds have actually migrated to Florida and they are hungry and looking for food. So your choice in plants, if it's not going to be for your vegetable garden, but your perimeters will be very important at this time of year. Plants like rouge plant and beautyberry are going to be important for providing some of the berries for our birds. Plants like that tropical sage and salt and pepper are key for helping produce nectar for those bees and butterflies that are still awake and moving around. But if you're looking for more plant ideas to help wildlife through the month of January, you should get the Wild Floridian Garden Planner. It is full of plant ideas from native vines to native wildflowers to native shrubs, plus also identifying plants for hummingbirds, berries for birds, seeds for birds, and of course giving you lots of information about tropicals and vegetables and what to plant, plus even more tips to help keep you on track for the month of January. You can go ahead and get the planner at www.wildfloridian.net/planner, and you can go ahead and make it a bundle with the best-selling Beginner's Guide to Florida Gardening. After you snag a copy of that, if you are wondering about more tips to help keep you on track for the winter, go ahead and check out this video right here. If you still want to get a crash course in how Florida gardening works all year round, go ahead and check this video out right here. And if you're interested in getting into native plants, go ahead and check out these 10 native plants for beginners. Okay, I'll see you soon. Bye.